Sunday Baroque Conversations is made possible by the Friends of Sunday Baroque and is produced at WSHU Public Radio in Fairfield, Connecticut. I'm Suzanne Bona. Thank you for listening. Don't miss an episode of Sunday Baroque Conversations. Subscribe on Apple, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please leave us a review. If you want to find out where you can listen to our weekly show, visit our website, sundaybaroque.org, for a station list and our 24/7 stream. Again, that's sundaybaroque.org. Mahan Esfahani is a harpsichordist with an international career. The award-winning musician was born in Tehran in 1984. He grew up in the United States, and he studied musicology and history at Stanford University and eventually completed his harpsichord studies in Prague. He was the first and only harpsichordist to be named a BBC New Generation Artist. Mahan Esfahani's repertory spans centuries. Now, Baroque music makes up the lion's share of his recordings, but he's also recorded music by 20th century American minimalist composer Steve Reich, modern Czech composer Bohuslav Martinu, avant-garde Hungarian composer George Ligeti, and others. He's also commissioned music by some of today's top composers. I am so pleased to have Mahan Esfahani join me on Zoom to talk about his life in music. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So let's begin with your introduction to music. How old were you when you started making music, and how did that come about?
Well, I don't remember when I didn't make music. My father played music. So, I mean, inevitably, that one is simply drawn to music. I mean, I wasn't a very sort of sporty child. So, I mean, it made sense that as soon as I could make some semblance of music with him, I did it. And I don't remember when that started. It was just always sort of there. And so that's that.
Playing a harpsichord, though? Were you playing other instruments?
Well, playing the piano. And I mean, you know, at church there was an organ, and one gets drawn to what one hears. Right. And, you know, I'd like to think that maybe that's where probably I discovered Bach. And in that sense, you know, what I heard in the organ loft, I'm always trying to replicate somehow. You know, what you feel when you first hear that music, you think, well, okay, I'd like to chase that feeling somehow.
Yeah. Tell me about that feeling, because Bach obviously really is a touchstone for so many musicians, and not just classical musicians. So I'd love to hear sort of your personal connection to it.
I'm glad you said that, because I always had a dream about, you know, going to sort of 100 major musicians in all kinds of genres of music and saying who's the greatest composer, and you know, them mostly I imagine saying Bach. I mean, look, there are as many ways of looking at Bach as there are people. I mean, in a sense, Bach is the great equalizer. People say, I was recently at an awards ceremony where all kinds of nonsense was said. And one of the bits of nonsense that was said was, oh, you know, Bach is universal. Bach is not universal. You know, it's not that, you know, humans in some part of the world who are engaged with their own music are sort of, you know, losing out on life because they don't know Bach. That's not the issue. But I think within our field, Bach is the great equalizer because his technical greatness somehow is in inverse proportion to his own sense of self. Bach is an immensely modest composer. He's an immensely modest person. You know, in a sense, he puts himself on our level. I know that that's not a common thing to hear. We of course put Bach on such a pedestal, and we think so highly of him that we forget that, first of all, Bach did not consider himself the greatest composer of his time. He didn't even consider himself the greatest composer in his family. But moreover, he, you know, in a sense, the individual does not play a great part in his music. It's not to say that it's abstract, but that rather he subsumes his own greatness in service of something greater. Now that, you know, we might say that's religion. Obviously, he was a devout person. He had a great sense for a higher power. There's certainly that, and I think Bach would not deny that. But there's also a matter of that that art is something much bigger than the here and now, and there's that sort of constant asking of questions that he does. I mean, in a sense, it's engineered to be the perfect music to listen to and to engage with over a lifetime, because the moment you feel you've arrived at an answer, he just sort of takes it away from you. And he makes you sort of keep coming back.
I want to double back just a little bit, because you talked a moment ago about organ music. Obviously, that relates to Bach, but you talked about organ music being sort of one of those early influences, in addition to your dad's playing music. And by the way, what did your dad play? What music did your dad make? Piano. Okay. So why are you not an organist? How did you become a harpsichordist?
Oh, I recently published an article about my many attempts to be an organist. Well, some things happen, some things don't. I mean, I became a fairly creditable pianist. But organ requires being alone, somewhere cold all the time. It requires, of course, driving to a church to practice the organ. And I mean, practically, it just sort of didn't work out. But there's that completeness of a musician that ideally would sort of show their best at the organ. And I mean, there's that, if you like, sort of multimedia aspect of the organ, that the organ was an instrument in constant flux. They were constantly innovating on it. They, no two organs are alike. They certainly were not in Bach's time. And, so it's a space for sort of constant innovation and engagement with the technology of an instrument. And, organists understood, this sort of, I mean, one of the things that organists have to study is organ design, right? And I mean, concerning oneself with what happens, if you like, behind the keyboard, is something that as pianists we don't learn. We learn to basically not concern ourselves with that. I think harpsichordists learn it to an extent, but if you know how what you're doing physically leads to the sound that you want, then you can do anything, right? And I mean, in that sense, ironically, my playing of the clavichord, which is by far the quietest instrument, has been most profoundly affected by my interest in the organ, which is the loudest instrument. Because at the end of the day, you have to understand mechanically and physically what it is that you're doing.
Right. You're making me think, as you're talking that way, about like a pilot understanding how the mechanics of the plane works. And I think that I don't know how my car works.
But the early petrol heads and the early pilots were all builders,
right?
And I think that relationship to the instrument is something that I think in the mainstream of music we've lost for sure. And it's a complete musician is someone who encompasses all of these areas of sort of study.
But of course, people do make their own harpsichords.
People do. And I mean, often people make their own harpsichords because they can't afford to buy a harpsichord. So, I mean, in my experience, we built a kit harpsichord because we didn't have the money for a harpsichord. So, I mean, I became interested in that around, when I was 16 or 17. And, but I didn't think I was going to become a harpsichordist. I mean, I thought I was going to do some sort of, gainful employment in other field and, maybe listen to harpsichord music once in a while. I mean, in a weird way, I wonder whether now that I'm on the cusp of 40, did this career happen partly because I tried hard to prove to myself that it was possible to become a harpsichordist in spite of all odds. I mean, I wasn't put in through a sort of conservatoire track from a young age. I certainly didn't come from the sort of, family of sort of, middle bourgeois sort of artsy urban families in the sort of coasts or sort of in Europe that would have easily led to becoming a musician, of course, and would have had the support networks for being a musician. I just simply was lucky that I had some very good teachers, both in school and outside of school. And, I was sort of persistent, and for better or worse, I'm persistent in sort of everything that I do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's very evident, and also not only persistent, but clearly quite curious and clearly quite willing to, kind of bust the boundaries. You have a really varied career, playing solo harpsichord music, but also chamber music collaborations, and you're collaborating with major symphony and chamber orchestras and contemporary music ensembles, and that's a little uncommon for a harpsichordist.
Yeah, I mean,
Go
we
ahead.
didn't really know, forgive me for interrupting you. We didn't, I have to say, when I say we, I mean me and my agents, we didn't really know that I would be so active playing so many concertos.
Uh-huh.
We thought like, maybe a year, 3 or 4 tops. We didn't
Mm-hmm.
know that it would be sort of, I'd be going through the list of the conductors in the orchestras and playing concertos. And
Right.
I mean, as to the idea of that's not commonly what a harpsichordist does, I mean, I don't really know what other harpsichordists do. I don't really
Mm-hmm.
pay attention. But I mean, it was certainly the case during the time of the revival of the harpsichord earlier in the 20th century. I mean, people like Landowska, people like Ralph Kirkpatrick, George Malcolm in England, other figures um, were mainstream artists who were playing with symphony orchestras and playing in big halls. And I'd like to think that maybe that's the path that I'm following.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, probably many of your Sunday Baroque listeners will turn the dial off now that I say this. But I mean, a sort of separate field called that calls itself early music doesn't interest me massively. I mean, I'm interested in early music. I'm interested in the repertoire. I'm interested in the sort of performance practice and the research aspect of it. But I mean, I largely come to my own conclusions. And like the idea that we'd be a world separate from everyone else and that we know the truth and the rest are idiots doesn't appeal to me massively. I have other areas in my life in which I think people are idiots, but like music is not one of them. Like I like to generally be part of the community. So that's how I do. That's my modus operandi, if you like.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And I saw a quote from you that your goal is to, and I am quoting here, rehabilitate the harpsichord in the mainstream of concert instruments. And it seems like that is what you're doing, and seems like there's some intent there. So I'd love for you to explain and elaborate on that. Why rehabilitate?
I say a lot of things. Well, I mean, rehabilitate, because can you believe it? There are still people who refuse to see what's in front of their nose. I mean, I'm not going to name names because I think it's pointless. But I mean, I'm always in touch with various conductors and feel very supported by many conductors. Was recently in touch with a fairly well-known older conductor because I won a couple of prizes recently for a recording of concertos that I did with modern orchestra, and it was about collaborating together. And I had been to an orchestra that this conductor had been to recently, and I thought, well, we cross paths, so we should do something. And his response was, well, I just really don't see how harpsichord with orchestra works. And I was like, I was just here, and you just saw that I did this. So like, did you did you think it was some sort of like hologram in front of you? Like, what is it that, like, you literally just, like, that movie Ghost Dad with Bill Cosby where he gets hit by the bus and then nobody can see him? I think, is this like a sort of Ghost Dad scenario where like you didn't see it, or what is it? And my jokes aside, I mean, some people are going to see it and some are not. Some people are going to, you get the review at least once a year. I say you get the review, I get the review at least once a year, which is, oh, there was so many dynamics, it was so interesting, so many colors, but what a shame he plays an instrument without dynamics. And it's like, but you just said there were dynamics. Like, you just said that there was
Right.
color. You just said that there was expression. And so, it's amazing. People, there's something called Bayesian updating, right, in statistics, which is that even if you see new evidence to the contrary, your brain will try to shoehorn that into what you assumed before.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of a a little bit of a one-man missionary machine here. I don't have a whole sort of bunch of missionaries helping me. So the convincing takes one day at a time, and I always see it as sort of 3 steps forward, 2 steps backward. But fortunately, slowly we are going forward. And if you told me 15 years ago that this is what I'd be doing, I'd say you were crazy. So, all in all, on this sort of long scale trajectory, things are, going well, and you've caught me on a good day.
So, given your feelings about Bach and your experience with Bach, and given your feelings about the so-called like early music world, such as it is, I'm going to put you on the spot here and ask you what you think about Bach or any Baroque era composer, pre-piano composer, piano era composer. What do you think about their music on the piano?
Well, I think you're not asking anything that nobody else has. Forgive me, that nobody else has asked.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's great. I mean, I don't know why. I think, forgive me, but I think the question is flawed.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because they coexisted at the same time. Mm-hmm. It's not like it was either or, right? Mm-hmm. It wasn't like, do you want the salmon or do you want the chicken? Like, that's not how it works. Like, you can have salmon and chicken. And like, I think the more important question is it good salmon? Is it good chicken? Or is it bad salmon or bad chicken? And I'm always reminded of the quote of Ralph Kirkpatrick, who's a big sort of idol of mine, who said that he was ashamed the number of times he played on terrible harpsichords when there was a perfectly good Steinway D backstage. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think the issue is that occasionally the sound of early instruments leads people to suspend their critical faculties. Mm-hmm. So that they hear it, they think, well, this is the right way. Therefore, I can't question. Like, I've done this experiment before with period instruments. Not that I do much with period instruments, but with period orchestras, I throw at them everything I've heard in a big orchestral romantic symphony orchestra interpretation. They do it, and nobody questions it. Mm-hmm. Right? It shows you that it's the period instrument acts as a prop that suspends critical faculties, mm-hmm. and that. But if I ask them to do those things on modern instruments, people would lambaste you for using modern instruments. Mm-hmm. I did some playing with Emmanuel Paoud, who's an absolutely wonderful flutist, as you know, the principal flute of the Berlin Film. Mm-hmm. We have some planned stuff coming up in the future. And Emmanuel and I, we get on super. Mm-hmm. And someone in early music said, yes, but what a shame it's a modern flute. And I thought, did you have cotton in your ears? Like, what was it what is it ideologically here? It reminds me of that part of Dante's Inferno, where like he goes to that circle where there's all these good people, but they were before Christ, and therefore they have to be in the Inferno because, like, oops, you missed Jesus, right? And so I think what a shame that these things became ideological. And by the way, if you look at the great figures in the revival of early music, I name in particular Nicholas Harnoncourt, for example. I mean, Nicholas Harnoncourt was not an ideological figure, but his generation had to react against a certain degree of misunderstanding. I'd like to think that we've gone past that need for reaction. Mm-hmm. But occasionally, frankly, I do look at, oh boy, see, now the controversial side of me is going to come out. I do occasionally look at situations, particularly in the precarious state of funding for classical music, and I ask myself, does such and such town, does such and such hamlet, does such and such place, to the exclusion of money go into other arts initiatives, does it need an orchestra on period instruments? Because it's mostly going to be modern players who just put gut strings on theirs. I mean, what are we doing here, right? Like, if the issue is that you take a sort of ideologically, spick and span box so that everybody feels good, like, I'd rather go to the movies. I mean, I don't. I find that a lot of that is sort of is not really thought through past sort of moral parameters.
Mm-hmm. I love you finally sort of given me a really good word, because this is a question that I have to entertain often from some listeners, not a lot. I don't play only period instruments on Sunday Baroque. I completely concur with you that if it's good, it's good. If it's not, it's not. And that is not the measuring stick for what I play. But I love the word ideological, because I think music should be musical, not ideological. And so I love that. Thank you for giving me that.
Some music is ideological. I mean, I was listening the other day to, I have this Webern Complete Works box set, and it being Webern, it's like 4 CDs, right? It's like not that much. But I mean, some of Webern, and certainly the revival of Webern's music by Boulez and people, was ideological, and I understand why. I understand why, especially in North America, Weber became this kind of paradigm of the 12-tone composer, even though it kind of exaggerates his place in music history. I get that. I understand that. I understand why the revival of Bach was particularly important, particularly in Germany in the 19th century. There's some ugly sides to that. I think that there is a place for some measure of ideology in music, but I also think, for example, my biggest influence in Bach playing on the keyboard would have to be Nikolaeva. Nikolaeva that Shostakovich wrote his preludes and fugues for. And Nikolaeva is an immense pianist for so much different music. But when she plays Bach, yes, an Allemande, a Courant, yes, there's some element of the dance. Yes, we all accept that. That explains what the piece is. Nikolaeva makes you realize why the piece exists. What makes this living heart of this work tick? And, when you hear her play the French overture of Bach, it's something so much more than an entry-level music appreciation course saying a French overture is where you have a slow section with some jerky rhythms, and then you have a fugue. Like that doesn't tell me why this piece exists, because then you're just putting a Bach overture on the level of Telemann, who's a perfectly good composer, but it's not Bach. People don't. I bet actually my friend Reinhard Goebel would disagree with me here. People don't change the course of their lives for Telemann for the most part. But Bach, at least in my life, has caused me to make certain decisions. It caused me to decide to not become a lawyer. It made me decide to become a musician. It made me go to Prague to study with the great harpsichordist Růžičková. Bach has had an appreciable effect on how I lead my life. Therefore, the least I can do is to sort of delve into, why that is. And it must be something deeper than, what the sort of imminent sort of qualities of the symbols on the page tell me.
Yeah. So among the many hats that you wear, you're also a commentator on BBC Radio, and you've done...
Now and then, yes.
Yeah, and then you've done some radio documentaries as well on subjects like the early history of African-American classical composers and the development of orchestral music in Azerbaijan. How did you find your way to and become passionate about these topics?
Oh, well, that's very simple, actually. I had an in at the BBC for years. I lived in London for a long time. And, the BBC documentaries were basically a chance for me to explore subjects that I didn't know anything about. I'm not kidding you. I wish I had a nicer answer than that. But I didn't really know very much about African-American orchestral composers in the 1920s. So I said, let's make a documentary about it, and I'll find out. I didn't know anything about classical music in Azerbaijan. Let's find out. Now we've got one in development, which actually after our conversation, I have to answer a bunch of emails about, which would be about music education in the Midwest. I find the Midwest of the United States very interesting because, these notions on the coasts, which of course control, our discourse around music as they do around many things. There's an idea that classical music is dying, that like kids are growing up without music. Not in Michigan, not in Ohio. It's amazing what's going on in this part of the country. And I think it bears some investigation. So yeah, I know enough about it to be interested, and I'd like to, what can I say? I get the BBC to pay for me learning about things. So.
That's great. So this interview is taking place in October 2023. You are still in your 30s. Just about. And that's quite young in the world of classical music. There has, long been this big concern and fretting over drawing in younger listeners to classical music. I want to put you on the spot to see if you have ideas, if you have suggestions, you have observations about how to do that.
Well, I don't have kids, but I've seen people who interact with kids. And I remember when I was at Oxford, we had the great choir. I was at New College, and New College has the very famous foundational choir. And, you would see the choir master speak to the 5-year-olds and the 6-year-olds like adults. If you speak to children like adults, they'll act like adults. If you speak to children like children, they'll act like children.
Mm.
Pandering is a short-term fix because long-term thinking seems to not occur in a society with our anxieties. No one does long-term. Not our politicians, not our arts administrators, certainly not many musicians. I would say we are in well, I don't know if I could give this historical perspective, but we are in a sort of uniquely short term vision period right now. And my only view is that people sense integrity when there's integrity. Beyond that, here's the thing. I mean, I was like reasonably popular in high school. Like I was not like the coolest kid in high school, but I was like reasonably happy person, had friends, went out, sort of got invited to parties. And I occasionally feel that people in our field feel upset that like 30 years ago in high school, people didn't think they were cool. So now they're trying really hard to be cool later. And like, it comes across as like someone wearing dad jeans. And it does not, is not attractive. And I think there's a feeling of, we have to be down with the kids. It's about the kids. It's about the kids. Yeah. But I mean, first of all, even 60 years ago, you look at audiences, they tend to be older because older people have disposable income. Like that's just kind of how it is. And also, I mean, I won't name any names, but like certain like leading opera companies also like run the risk of alienating their core supporters who are long-term supporters who generationally have supported the art form. And couching their alienation in terms of the misplaced language of social grievance will have bad consequences. And I mean, I just worry about that.
What do you think is the answer then? What should they be doing?
Well, I think we should conserve what we have, and we should innovate because the arts require innovation. I mean, it has to be living, but it's not an either or equation. And it's not an equation about alienating, and it's not an equation about like inclusion doesn't mean the exclusion of others, right? Like at the end of the day, you have to make the pie bigger. And I think that implicitly, the idea of the older generation that this is a limited, I mean, I hate the metaphor of the pie, but like this is somehow a limited amount of pie and we all have to fight over it. But, I don't see many of the initiatives making it any bigger. I just see it, there's essentially a transfer of loyalty, a transfer of loyalty to potentially risky short-term loyalty. Right. Having said that, look, I mean, did there need to be some element of reckoning in the field, particularly in North America? I mean, I haven't lived in North America for almost 20 years, but like, did there have to be some element of reckoning in terms of representation, in terms of like, outreach, more representation of performers and audiences that resembles the country that we see outside of the concert hall? No doubt. Of course that had to happen. There's no question that had to happen. But again, you don't include and then exclude. You include because you say classical music makes a claim to being a transatlantic artistic and aesthetic movement. For that claim to be taken seriously, you have to include everyone. And the people who had access to it before, they're not ogres, they're not terrible people. They don't need to be, told that they're sort of, morally equivalent to sort of Genghis Khan. Like that's not, like none of that helps. And likewise, I don't think that we should apologize for the art form. I mean, I've lived in the Czech Republic for 8 years, almost 9 years. And there's not an apology for the fact that, yeah, coming to appreciate this art form requires a little bit of background information. requires keeping up with things, requires educating yourself, requires asking others for help, like food, like appreciating anything that evinces and demonstrates a life of beauty and that goes beyond the utilitarian. And to apologize for that comes across as behavior by people who are upset they weren't cool in high school.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
So what else are you passionate about right now, musical or otherwise?
Well, I do read a lot.
Fiction, nonfiction?
Both. I started writing for a magazine in the UK. It has a relatively small circulation called The Critic, which is kind of the same crowd that, well, it's a little bit of a rival crowd to The Spectator and sort of magazines like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I've written a few book reviews for them.
Oh.
Because I love reading, so I thought, hey, why not get paid for reading?
Yeah.
And actually, I'm reading right now a book about Elizabeth McConkey, which is written by Erica Siegel, who's a musicologist out in California.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll be writing a review about that pretty soon. Writing a essay for my friend Paul Macrisha's new recording of Dream of Gerontius, the Elgar oratorio.
Mm-hmm.
So that'll come out. Actually, he's just texted me saying, where the heck is my essay? So I got to finish that. What else? I write a little bit of short form sort of nonfiction pieces and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm now in the last 250 pages of War and Peace.
Oh.
Finally, because it was always sort of staring at me and laughing at me from my bookcase. So I'm going to be done with that. And then, I don't know what I'm going to read. Maybe I try to keep up with new nonfiction. There is a book out by Katja Hoyer, who's a German-British historian, about the history of the DDR, of East Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't really know a lot of, I live right next door and I love going to East Germany, but I didn't really know too much about the history.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll probably read that. And, that's sort of what I do when I'm not playing music. I try to average maybe 80 pages a day, read in the morning, read in the evening. And,
yeah.
I think that the single greatest impact on my life was the public free library.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's the public free library is a cornerstone of a serious democracy. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have a free library paid for by the taxpayer, then we cannot make a claim to being democracies. I feel very strongly about that.
Yeah.
So I try to support my local library. I try to go a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the life of constant self-education. I always feel, not in a bad way, not like I don't get sort of stomach acid over it, but I constantly feel that I'm playing catch up intellectually. Yeah. And so I'm constantly trying to work on that to improve.
Yeah, lifelong learning. Mahan Esfahani is an award-winning harpsichordist with an international career as a soloist, chamber musician, music scholar, advocate. He joined me on Zoom. It has been such a pleasure to speak with you.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you very much.